In 1936, New York's District Attorney Thomas E. Dewey brought charges against Charles Lucky Luciano for running a prostitution ring. In April, while evading capture in Hot Springs, Arkansas, Luciano was arrested and sent back to New York for trial. Though Luciano insisted that he was not involved in prostitution, a series of witnesses testified against him, and the district attorney won his case. Deemed public enemy number one and king of a $12 million vice ring, Luciano was convicted on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 50 years in prison, the longest ever handed down for such a crime. He was sentenced in June of 1936 and sent to Sing Sing Correctional Facility in Ossining, New York. The stay was short-lived. Following an examination of his psychology and criminal history, it was recommended that Luciano be moved to a facility better suited for inmates with narcotics and/or mental health issues. He was transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, a remote, unwelcoming facility far away from New York City. In between working in the laundry room at Dannemora, Luciano continued to run his crime family from behind bars, relaying his orders through acting crime boss Vito Genovese. In 1937, Genovese fled to Naples to avoid an impending murder indictment in New York, so Luciano appointed his consigliere Frank Costello as the new acting boss and the overseer of Luciano's business interests. Luciano's legal appeals continued until October of 1938, when the United States Supreme Court refused to review his case. At this point, Luciano stepped down as family boss, and Costello formally replaced him. But that did not mean Luciano had given up the fight for freedom. Six years into his 50-year prison sentence and numerous appeals, Luciano's dark tide began to turn in his favor. It began in February of 1942, when the French ocean liner the Normandy caught fire and sank in New York Harbor while being retrofitted for naval use. How did it all start? Presumably, fear of Nazi sabotage on U.S. shores led to a clandestine collaboration between the Navy and New York's organized crime network. The Office of Naval Intelligence was concerned about German and Italian agents entering the U.S. through the New York waterfront. They also worried about sabotage in these facilities. Knowing that the mafia controlled the waterfront, the U.S. Navy contacted Meyer Lansky about a deal with Luciano. To facilitate negotiations, Luciano was transferred to Great Meadow Correctional Facility in Comstock, New York, closer in distance to New York City. The Navy, the state of New York, and Luciano reached a deal. In exchange for a commutation of his sentence, Luciano promised the complete assistance of his organization in providing intelligence to the United States Navy. Following several years of negotiations, and under circumstances that still remain a mystery, Charles Luciano's fight for freedom had been granted.
We have made a real start on cleaning the gangsters out of New York.
On January 3, 1946, as a presumed reward for his alleged wartime cooperation, New York Governor and former Special New York City Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey reluctantly commuted Luciano's sentence on condition that he not resist deportation to Italy.
Once the alliance between criminals and politicians is smashed, racketeering will come to a prompt end.
On February 2, 1946, two federal immigration agents transported Luciano from Sing Sing prison to an undisclosed location on Ellis Island in New York Harbor for deportation proceedings. He was placed in a room guarded and locked from the outside. Luciano spent several days in wait, yet able to receive visitors. Among them was the Prime Minister of the Underworld, Frank Costello. February 8, 1946, Charles Lucky Luciano is taken to Pier 7 in Brooklyn, New York, and placed aboard the Liberty ship, the SS Lorraine, bound for Italy. Brawny dock workers kept the curious newsman at bay. But according to Daily News reporter Art Smith, on February 9th, the night before his departure, Luciano shared a spaghetti dinner on his freighter with several guests. An entourage of 6 men, led by Albert Anastasia, boarded the ship around 8 p.m. What's more, and take this with a heavy dose of skepticism, the story continued with quoted conversation, allegedly between Anastasia and Luciano, that concluded at 11 p.m., with Luciano delivering a farewell speech. While Luciano came to terms with his future as he boarded the Lorraine freighter in Bush Terminal, Brooklyn, his associates gave him an envelope containing roughly $300,000. On February 28th, after a 17-day voyage, Luciano's ship arrived in Naples, avoiding the press as much as possible, commenting only that the voyage was pleasant. He first settled in Sicily, then moved to Palermo, then Rome. After being forced out of Rome by Italian police, he finally settled in Naples and immediately began planning his return to the United States. From the moment he arrived in Italy, Luciano tried to maintain a low profile and dropped out of public view for several months. Gossip columns told of Lucky in Paris, rendezvousing with old flame and former showgirl Gay Orlova. Sure, there were the publicly known jaunts Luciano would make to Rome and Sicily. But law enforcement and the press were far more interested in whispers of a trip to Latin America, specifically Mexico. Rumors of other travel plans began circulating even before his arrival. Luciano's affluent lifestyle continued in Italy. He was able to conduct transatlantic mob business for much of the rest of his life. With his deportation to Italy, Luciano now had the opportunity to import heroin from North Africa through Italy and Cuba into the United States and Canada. He made connections with Sicily's most prominent bosses, such as Don Calogero Vizzini, who had the greatest political connections of all the Sicilian bosses. However, no amount of luxury could alleviate Luciano's miserable homesickness. One small consolation was the California, an American-themed restaurant in Naples frequented by American tourists, with whom Luciano enjoyed to mingle. During one of his many visits to Naples, Luciano's friend Mark Lawrence recollected asking him, "What can I do for you, Lucky?" To which he replied, "I want to hear New York talk." In early fall of 1946, Luciano received a sealed envelope from a recently deported U.S. mafioso. Inside were 3 words. In late September, Luciano obtained 2 Italian passports issued in his real name, Salvatore Lucania, with visas for Mexico, Cuba, and several South American nations. Luciano was now on his way to visit the Western Hemisphere and meet with several criminal associates from the U.S. Luciano secretly relocates to Havana, Cuba, first taking a freighter from Naples to Caracas, Venezuela, then a flight to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, before flying to Mexico City and doubling back to Caracas, where he takes a private plane to Cuba. He was then driven to Havana, where he moved into an estate in the Miramar section of the city. Meyer Lansky greeted his old friend upon his arrival to Cuba. Luciano wanted to move closer to the U.S. so that he could resume control over American mafia operations and eventually return home. Lansky was already established as a major investor in Cuban gambling and hotel projects. Lansky quickly suggested that Luciano purchase a $150,000 interest in the Hotel Nacional, a plush casino and hotel owned by Lansky and his silent partner, Cuban President Fulgencio Batista. Luciano agreed and the Havana Conference was set. Following Luciano's orders, Lansky organized a conference in Havana the week of December 22nd of all crime bosses from all over the United States, dubbed the Havana Conference. The conference was to take place at the Hotel Nacional de Cuba and last a little more than a week. To welcome Luciano back from exile and acknowledge his continued authority within the mob, all the conference invitees brought Luciano cash envelopes. These Christmas presents totaled more than $200,000. At the first night's dinner hosted by Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Joe Adonis, Luciano was presented with the money. The official cover story for the Havana Conference was that the mobsters were attending a gala party with Frank Sinatra as the entertainment.
I know you're not very far.
Sinatra flew to Havana with Al Capone cousins, Charlie, Rocco, and Joseph Fischetti from Chicago. Joseph Joe Fish Fischetti, an old Sinatra acquaintance, acted as Sinatra's chaperone and bodyguard. Charlie and Rocco Fischetti delivered a suitcase containing $2 million to Luciano. His share of the U.S. rackets he still controlled. Mob figures were present representing New York City, New Jersey, Buffalo, Chicago, New Orleans, and Florida. The largest delegation of bosses was from the New York, New Jersey area. The most pressing topics on the conference agenda were the leadership and authority within the New York mafia. The mob controlled Havana casino interests. The narcotics operations, and the West Coast operations of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, especially the new Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. Luciano, absent from the American underworld scene for several months, was especially concerned with the situation brewing in New York. Vito Genovese had returned to New York from exile in Italy and was not content with assuming a minor role in the organization. Officially, Genovese was now just a capo regime. However, he had made it clear that he intended to take control of the Luciano crime family. Since Luciano's deportation in 1946, Luciano ally Frank Costello had been the acting boss of the Luciano family. As a result, tensions between the Castellano and Genovese factions had started to fester. During the Havana Conference, Luciano detailed the proposed drugs network to the bosses. After arriving in Cuba from North Africa, the mob would ship the narcotics to U.S. ports controlled primarily in New York City, New Orleans, and Tampa. The narcotics shipped to the New York docks would be overseen by the Luciano crime family, later the Genovese crime family, and the Mangano crime family, later the Gambinos. In New Orleans, the operation would be overseen by the Marcello crime family. In Tampa, the narcotics shipments would be overseen by the Trafficante crime family, led by Santo Trafficante Jr. The Havana Convention delegates voted to approve the plan. The next item on the agenda at the Havana Conference was what Lansky called the Siegel situation. In the mid-1930s, the New York and Chicago crime families had been sent west to establish and oversee a race wire service, gambling activities in Los Angeles and Nevada, and supervise narcotics shipments from Mexico. The Flamingo Hotel was the creation of William Richard Wilkerson, a Hollywood nightclub owner and one of the founders of The Hollywood Reporter. By the mid-1940s, it was still unfinished. This Flamingo Hotel project became Siegel's obsession. Siegel persuaded his longtime friend and business associate, Meyer Lansky, to help him sell New York and Chicago crime bosses on investing in this project. Siegel promised the bosses that the hotel and casino would be a smart and profitable investment. The Flamingo project immediately ran into problems. Siegel appointed his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, as a project overseer. As a result, contractors were stealing from Siegel. They would sell him materials one day, then steal them from the building site at night, only to resell them back to him the next day. The project was also impacted by the rising cost of materials and labor from the post-World War II building boom. To make matters worse, the bosses suspected Siegel and Hill of stealing Flamingo project money. Lansky and the bosses had discovered that Hill was taking frequent trips to Zurich, Switzerland, and depositing money into a bank account. They suspected that Siegel was skimming money and might flee the country if the Flamingo failed. Following a discussion, the bosses voted to execute Siegel. They assigned Chicago outfit consigliere Charles Trigger-Happy Fischetti to oversee the contract. The actual hit would be given to Jack Dragna, boss of the Los Angeles crime family. Dragna, who despised Siegel, then gave the contract to mob hitman John Frankie Carbo, a soldier in the Lucchese crime family. At the last minute, Siegel got a reprieve. The partly completed Flamingo Hotel was scheduled to open December 26. Longtime Siegel friend Lansky convinced Luciano and the other bosses to see how the hotel did during its grand opening. The men agreed and took a break to enjoy Christmas. But Luciano and his associates soon learned that the Flamingo's grand opening was a monumental bust. The enraged mobsters demanded Siegel's head. Lansky again convinced them to wait. He argued that Siegel could still save the casino and make money. After 2 weeks, the Flamingo Hotel closed to resume construction. The completed hotel opened several months later. The Flamingo started making a small profit, but by then, mafia investors had finally lost patience with Siegel. Towards the end of the Havana Conference, tension between Charles Luciano and Vito Genovese allegedly reached a boiling point. The two men had a private meeting in Luciano's hotel suite at Hotel Nacional. The year before, the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division had shipped Genovese from Italy back to New York to face trial on a 1934 murder charge. However, in June of 1946, the charges were dismissed, which left Genovese free to return to mob business. Unlike acting mob boss Frank Costello, Luciano never trusted Genovese. In this meeting, Genovese told Luciano that the United States government knew he was in Cuba and was pressuring the Cuban government to expel him. Genovese tried to convince Luciano to become a tutelar boss of bosses and turn over leadership of the Luciano family to Genovese. Luciano did not take kind to Vito Genovese's counsel. Positive that Genovese had tipped off the United States government of his presence in Havana, Cuba, Luciano snapped. He proceeded with a beatdown to Genovese, breaking 3 of Genovese's ribs. It was several days before Vito could travel again, at which point Luciano and Anastasia put him on a plane to the States, under the threat of death should Genovese mention the incident to anyone.
We have made a real start on cleaning the gangsters out of New York. In 2 years, we have shown that our people can be protected, that they can be delivered from the grip of the mob.
In February of 1947, the New York City news outlets got wind of the fact that Charles Luciano was in Havana, Cuba. U.S. drug agent Harry Anslinger demanded that the Cuban government deport Luciano back to Italy. Anslinger claimed that Luciano was behind the recent surge of heroin into the United States. When Cuba refused to comply, Anslinger took his case to the president, Harry S. Truman. The United States government then halted all shipments of medical supplies and equipment into Cuba while Luciano was still on Cuban soil. It took only several weeks for the Cuban government to comply, at which time Charles Lucky Luciano was arrested and sent back to Italy.